Hi, my name is Ida Milne. I'm European History Lecturer at Carlow College. And today in this Carlow College Leaving Certificate History Lecture Series, we are looking at the foundation of the European Economic Community and really the beginnings of European integration. After two world wars, many parts of Europe were really badly damaged. Millions of young soldiers had been killed, families had been torn apart. About 20 million people had been forced to migrate during the First World War and something similar during the Second World War. So that damage really affected the fabric of societies and economies. And remember, too, that during wars, a lot of focus goes towards supporting the armies financially and creating weapons. And that money has to come from somewhere. So it's either borrowed or it's taken away from other sectors like health and other domestic interests. So many people really came to the conclusion after the coincidence of two world wars being so close together that militarism wasn't the way forwards. And they searched for another solution. The obvious answer was economics. And the economic solution that they did find brought about more prosperity for member countries and helped to keep Europe stable from after the Second World War until now. Maybe at the moment, what's happening is because that mission has been so successful for many years, we've forgotten exactly what Europe does for us. But I'm really, as you'll probably realize, a committed supporter of the European integration project because I think it's been so good for, in particular, Ireland, but the other countries as well. In the post-war period and with the emerging Cold War, with the division of um, the world really between two different economic systems, capitalism on one hand and communism on the other. So the setting up of the Soviet bloc and then broadly the capitalist countries in Western Europe as well. This sees a lot more engagement in Europe with the concept of European unity. Europe had been torn apart, not just by the two world wars, but by earlier wars in the 19th century and before. And it had been economically destroyed time and time again. One of the most prominent economic thinkers at the time was the British economist John Maynard Keynes. And Keynesian economic thinking became really dominant in Western Europe, and it still really impacts today as well, that strong economies are stable economies. And this is really key to the reasons that they brought, and the founding fathers, and they were all fathers, really brought together the idea of setting up a European economic community. Um, my father was a great historian of 1798, a local historian in Wexford. And one of his findings was that um, revolutions are often fueled by economic instability. And that if we look, for example, in the southeast, we see that a drop in the price of barley, which was Wexford agriculture's main crop, in 1797, it dropped from about 20 shillings a barrel down to 6 shillings a barrel very quickly. That it became a motivation for the rebellion in Wexford in 1798. So you often look for the economic reason for instability in a country, and it'll give you clues to why a population decides to go to war or decides to go into rebellion. The European Coal and Steel Community is one of the first post-World War II cooperations. It was founded in 1951 by the Treaty of Paris, and it was signed by Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany. It was prompted by a really inspirational speech by French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman. It's probably the most influential speech in European Union history. And you can see that on the very wonderful europa.eu site, which gives a lot of the history of the European Union. And it also has some really great pen pictures of those founding fathers and what their thinking was like on European integration. The European Coal and Steel Community can be seen as a practical follow-up to the Schuman Declaration. And the treaty itself marked the birth of what would become the European Union as we know it today. The name changed in more recent years as the Union expanded, the EEC expanded further. So this is a picture here of Robert Schuman on the right-hand side. He was French foreign minister between 1948 and 1952 in the immediate post-war period. And he proposed, along with Jean Monnet, another French politician, joint control of coal and steel production. And they are the most important materials for the armament industry. And the basic or genius idea was that whoever did not have control over coal and steel production to, their heart's content, would not be able to fight a war. Germany had been able to amass, they had a lot of coal, and they had been able to amass a lot of steel as well. Coal was used to provide power in factories and to produce steel. And with steel, together, these are the key components to make most of the weapons and the machinery of war, the tanks, etc., as well as like that. Part of the speech that he made said these really iconic phrases or expressions. He said, "World peace cannot be safeguarded without the making of creative efforts proportionate to the dangers that threaten it." So I suppose in that idea is entailed the idea that we have to be brave sometimes. We have to take big steps in order to curtail dangers. And if you think about it, the idea of economic interaction between countries was quite a brave move at the time, because you're giving away some autonomy to the organization rather than to your individual country. So they had to, if you like, take a punt on that this would work, and indeed it did. Another key phrase in his speech was, "Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements, which first create a de facto solidarity." So that initial, after the creation of the Treaty of Rome and the initial signing by the smaller group, became over years a much expanded Europe until the one that we have today, which is far larger, despite Britain leaving there a few years back. Another key phrase was, "The pooling of coal and steel production will change the destinies of those regions which have long been devoted to the manufacture of the munitions of war, of which they have also been the most constant victims." So you can see that eureka idea about the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community there, and in that link there, if you want to try that afterwards. The German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, immediately recognized the opportunity for a peaceful Europe and agreed. So now you get the chief protagonists, France on the one side and Germany on the other side, if you like. They're both agreeing to that this would be a good idea. The governments of Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands also saw the merit of the idea. So here you see an image of Konrad Adenauer. He was the first Chancellor of the Federal Republic of Germany. He stood at the head of the newly formed state from 1949 to 1963, again in the immediate post-war period, and changed really the face of post-war German and European history. You could argue more than any one other individual. Like many politicians of his generation, he had already realized following the First World War that lasting peace could only be achieved through a united Europe. And his experiences during the Germany of the Third Reich, he was removed from office as the mayor of Cologne by the Nazis, served to confirm his opinion. In the 6 years from 1949 to 1955, Adenauer realized far-reaching foreign policy goals to bind Germany's future with Western alliance. Membership of the Council of Europe from 1951, foundation of the European Coal and Steel Community from 1952, and Germany's entry into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is more of a militaristic, is the militaristic wing, I suppose, of negotiation, of integration, from 1955. And a key cornerstone of Adenauer's foreign policy was reconciliation with France. Together with French President Charles de Gaulle, a historic turning point was achieved. In 1963, the one-time arch-enemies, Germany and France, signed a treaty of friendship, which became one of the milestones on the road to European integration. That idea of cooperation between France and Germany continues to this day, where even on things like the commemoration of the First and Second World Wars, the Chancellor and the President of France often do this commemoration together to show an integrated commemoration, even though they were enemies in the wars. Here you'll see a link to Adenauer's ideas about the European coal and steel community, where you can look at it in your own time. To look then at West Germany and the idea of European integration, and particularly the European coal and steel community, the relationship with France was key to West Germany's recovery. And Germany agreed to join the ECSC to coordinate production in the coal and steel industries. And again, their natural terrain was very full of, in particular, coal. So the political aim was to break the pattern of hostility between France and Germany and develop key areas of mutual interest. The treaty obliged members to agree to the principle of supranationality. That is handing over the control of industries to an international body. And again, this takes quite a big punt for a country to have to do. To have confidence and to trust your old enemy is a huge thing to be brave enough to do. And, you know, some people in your own country will question, why are you doing this? They're the enemy. They've been the enemy for a long time. So West Germany saw the treaty as a confirmation of their new state's legitimacy and rehabilitation. Adenauer said, "Das ist unser Durchbruch." This is our breakthrough. That's a quote from Tony Judd in Post-War on page 127. Here you can see the map of Germany as it was before unification in 1990, with the Federal Republic of Germany on the western side and the German Democratic Republic on the other side behind the wall. So the European coal and steel community from 1950 began to unite European countries economically and politically in order to secure lasting peace. And part of the reason for the determination to make this succeed is that the 1950s were dominated by the East-West Cold War, which divided Europe essentially, as well as the rest of the world. So here is a map of the Eastern Bloc in red and the Western Bloc in blue, and the Iron Curtain, the white line in between there, as you see it there. To look at the Warsaw Pact of 1955, it's formerly known as the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation and Mutual Assistance. The Warsaw Pact is created on the 14th of May 1955, immediately after West Germany joins NATO. It is complemented. It complements the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, which is the regional economic organization set up by the Soviet Union in January 1949 for the communist states of Central and Eastern Europe. The Warsaw Pact embodies what is known as the Eastern Bloc, while NATO and its member countries and its allies, like which we would be one, really represented the Western Bloc. NATO and the Warsaw Pact were ideologically opposed and over time built up their own defences, starting an arms race that lasted throughout the Cold War. And while we are technically neutral, we would still be seen as part of a broader bloc, and we have a memorandum of understanding with the NATO countries. But we're still neutral, just to make that clear. Consolidation of the Cold War with Europe, concerned about being the middle, um, happens. And then again, it's a form of battleground. The background threat of war really underlines the whole European unity idea, the idea of making Europe an economic unit that can hold together and that makes war no longer necessary. Two further communities were proposed after the coal and steel community. One was a European defence community and the other was a European political community. The former was rejected by the French Parliament, and after a conference in Messina in 1955, Paul Henry Spaak, a Belgian socialist politician who you see here on the left, was appointed to work on the idea of a customs union. He had been imprisoned by the Germans during the First World War, and he had served as Belgian foreign minister in exile during the Second. So he was another of the great European Union pioneers who had actually witnessed the horrors of Europe's bloodiest century very closely. Although most of Europe was in ruins after the Second World War, he saw it as an opportunity to make a strong and peaceful continent again through economic and political cooperation. His SPAC report, it wasn't just him, it's done by committee, together with another report, the Olin report, was a report drafted by a group of experts of the International Labour Organization led by Bertil Olin in 1956, provided the basis for the Treaty of Rome in 1957. And this treaty really set up the establishment of the European Economic Community. Spaak himself went on to become General Secretary of NATO and a leading figure in the Treaty of Rome negotiations. So you can see the links already between the EEC and NATO, although although the EEC doesn't technically have a military wing. The significance of the SPAC and Olin reports. The SPAC report concluded that a sector-by-sector integration of the European economies would be difficult, and that instead they should have a horizontal integration of the economy by gradually eliminating trade barriers, and that was the way to continue. That the goal that would ultimately be achieved would be achieved by creating a customs union, and ultimately that is what happened. The Olin report agreed that the common market didn't presuppose a harmonized level of labour standards, that exchange rates between countries reflected economic productivity and so offset the advantage of lower wages than other states. Therefore, states with a higher level of social protection and higher wages shouldn't fear competition from low-cost countries. And this has been a continual argument right throughout the expansion of the European Union, where new member countries have to achieve a certain level of economic stability before they can join. So the European Economic Community was created by the Treaty of Rome in 1957. The aim was to bring about economic integration to include a common market amongst its 6 original members, the 6 founding members, Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and West Germany. It incorporated a common set of institutions, the earlier European Coal and Steel Community and the European Atomic Energy Community, Euratom, under the 1965 Treaty of Brussels. There's literally a series of treaties that changes the scope and membership of the EEC until we get what we have today as the EU. So they're all named usually by the place where the meeting took place that established the treaty. The principle of European integration is really back to the Keynesian idea that strongly connected economies are less likely to go to war. To refer back again to the founding fathers of the European Union, who I mentioned earlier, if you look at Europeana now, you'll see that they've included some women in this list also. to address the gender balance, but most of the people who held key posts in establishing the European Economic Community were men. I suppose it just reflects the political landscape at the time. So, from resistance fighters to lawyers, they were a diverse group of people who held the same ideals, a peaceful, united, and prosperous Europe. They included, and you'll see pen pictures for all these on the Europeana site, Sico Mansholt, Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman, Paul Henry Spaak, Altieri Spinelli, Winston Churchill of Britain, Konrad Adenauer of Germany, amongst many others. But to somebody of my generation, they're the people who were always in the news in the 1960s, 1970s for some of them, and who were talking about the European ideal and about the various threats that were in the world at the time in the post-war period. This one is coming from a farming background in Wexford. This one is my particular hero, Sico Mansholt, who founded the Common Agricultural Policy. At that time, if you were involved in farming, you were depending on not only local market fluctuations, but also global market fluctuations or regional market fluctuations. So something like if you were a barley producer or a wheat producer, if Canada, one of the major grain growers, had a particularly good year, or Ukraine, another major grain grower in the period, had a particularly good year, you might find that the price of barley for you would drop, and there would be less interest in your barley or your wheat or whatever on the world market. You'd find it harder to sell it because they'd be looking for higher quality stuff. So what CAP does is, for many agricultural products, it creates a feeling of stability, and particularly, I think, in relation to milk, but also to other farm goods as well. So Sico Mansholt was a farmer. He's a member of the Dutch resistance during the Second World War. He's a national politician. He's the first European commissioner responsible for agriculture. His ideas laid the basis for the Common Agricultural Policy of the European Union, and this was one of the most prominent policies since its founding days. And Irish farmers, when we joined in 1973, we benefited greatly from it. He had witnessed the Dutch horrors, the horrors of the Dutch famine. Imagine a country like Holland, which is so good at producing food, actually having a famine at the end of the Second World War. And he was convinced that Europe needed to become self-sufficient and that a stable supply of affordable food should be guaranteed for all. And again, you can find more about him there under the Founding Fathers thing on europa.eu. The most common element in Mansholt's plan for the early Common Agricultural Policy was to encourage productivity in agriculture. A lot of countries at the time would be considered to have been subsistence farming, probably the same is true in Ireland as well, and that you would be trying to hedge your bets on your farm by having what was called a mixed farm, where you would have some maybe dairy cows to provide milk, but you might also not specialize in that you would perhaps raise some bullocks to sell in spring. You'd raise them over the winter for sale in spring. You might do some sheep, you might have a few pigs, but you wouldn't specialize. And really, what the Common Agricultural Plan aimed at doing was encouraging greater productivity and more specialization. So the policy implied systems where farmers are guaranteed a certain minimum price for their products, providing incentives for them to produce more, and encouraging not to hedge their bets with that kind of mixed farming. I grew up on a mixed farm, which started to change from the time that we moved into the European market and had access to it. His pro-European determination and strong vision for the future, coupled with will to build on a shared future, identified himself as really being, he was seen as being one of the really true Europeans, the espousers of the real European integration ideal. For Irish farmers, Ireland, Britain, and Denmark joined the EEC after a lot of debate in 1973. Britain had tried to join earlier, but had been vetoed. And we debated, you can look at the newspapers from the time and see how much we debated whether we should go in. But because most of our trade was with Britain at the time, broadly, we felt that if Britain went in, we really had to go in as well. Um, so for Irish farmers and other European farmers, CAP gave a great degree of economic stability. We had been a small open economy. We were very threatened by price fluctuations on world agricultural markets. And my particular memory of joining CAP was as a very young teenager on a tillage farm, mixed farm, which later became mostly a tillage farm in Wexford. I recall this as a time when the tiny little 20-year-old Massey Ferguson, which I could drive as a child, was swapped for a pair of great big, well, they seemed huge then, shiny new Ford 5000s. And anybody who knows Ford 5000s will know they're not huge tractors anymore. And this was really a period of renewed optimism for farmers. And in particular, I remember that we changed the kind of sheep that we were producing at the time to produce sheep, a Texel crossed with Suffolk rather than the Suffolk we just had before, to create a lean lamb for the French market. So many potential members of the EEC were really nervous about the process of European integration. The debates centered around things like the loss of autonomy, perhaps dealing with the old enemies. And not all Western European states were ready to commit to the process of integration. Britain traditionally had more of a focus on empire. It was undefeated and triumphant after the war. It had a confident nationalism. It also had an insular sense of security. The countries on the European landmass um, didn't have that advantage. Britain also had ties with the Commonwealth, with the USA, and believed that as an island empire, an island nation, Freudian slip there, that they did not belong to Europe. It relied less on Europe for trade. In 1947, British Empire exports were greater than the combined exports of the six. The UK Labour government had no wish to join an organisation that might limit its scope to pursue their socialist policies between 1945 and 1951 under the Labour government. But Britain's success in the war had come at a high price, with a quarter of the national wealth being lost, gold reserves were nearly exhausted, and only American loans were preventing collapse. So, cost of maintaining an overseas empire was also high, and striving to maintain great power status when it really was on the wane. And they couldn't compete with the USA and the Soviet Union, but they were trying to do it at the time. Was really expensive for them to keep a navy and an army that were of the level that they would have to do. In 1957, Germany's economy had become bigger than Britain's. You see here the average annual growth rates between 1950 and 1960. For the UK was 2.7, and for Germany it was 7.8%. So Germany is in a very big recovery, but France and Italy, who also joined the European Economic Community, are also doing well. And that source comes from H. Young, This Blessed Plot. Britain eventually decided it couldn't afford to be excluded from Europe and applied to join the EEC in 1963. But the French president, Charles de Gaulle, rejected the application because it thought Britain was too pro-American and really didn't essentially have European integration in its heart. And there was also the possibility, I suppose, that Britain might threaten France's leading role in Europe. They applied again in 1967. Again, it was rejected by de Gaulle, who said the British economy was too weak. But they eventually joined in 1973, in the same year as Ireland and Denmark. But really, ultimately, and that's not for the scope of this talk, they were never as comfortable with European integration as we were. And they, for example, never joined the euro. They didn't want to lose their own currency. So, to look finally, in conclusion, was the EEC a successful experiment in peace building? I think really the pattern of history over the years, since the foundation of the EEC itself in the 1950s and the European Coal and Steel Foundation before that, history shows that countries that joined the EEC stroke AU as it is today broadly experienced economic expansion, rising standards of living, and an overall benefit from the market advantages and controls. And it also, as the founding fathers hoped, helped to keep Europe broadly at peace. There were some wars, but they were more localized after two devastating wars that had impacted on most countries. Whether they were directly engaged or not, they could be impacted, like something like the price of bread would go up during wartime because productivity of wheat would be affected and because there was inflation generally. And it did this really alongside other bodies, such as the United Nations, from which Ireland has engaged very strongly as a peacekeeping nation around the world, and also the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which Ireland has not been a member of as a neutral country. So I'd like to just end it there and to wish you all luck with your future studies. And maybe we'll see some of you coming into Carlow College. We'd love to see you coming in. Thank you.